So section 10, the second question was, what were the characteristics of Italian fascism? How did Benito Mussolini seize power? Why is Italian fascism important? So first of all, fascism basically means, in a sense, is nationalism and socialism. There's a bit more to it than that. But a big emphasis is you accept nationalism and socialism, so you have state control of the economy to benefit the nation. That's the idea. And this system is very anti-communist. Fascists hate communists. Communists hate fascists. You may remember during the video we watched about China and the Tiananmen Square protests, the Chinese protesters actually were shouting, like, calling the army fascist. That's like the worst thing you could call them. And the way he seized power, remember, one other thing they believed in was the militarization of society. They were a lot of the followers of fascism were veterans. And so Mussolini just got a bunch of his followers together and said, we're marching on Rome, the capital of the country. And this freaked the government out because they weren't sure if the army would put down a protest led by veterans. Right? They didn't know if the army would be loyal. So in response to Mussolini threatening the government appointed him prime minister in hopes that they could control him. But instead of being able to control Mussolini, he will use that power to seize complete control of the country by 1924. Right? So he uses this kind of threat of violence to get a position in the government. Once he has that, he's able to expand his power in the government and eventually seize complete control. And this is important because Hitler basically tried to do the exact same thing. He tried twice. The first time he failed. The second time he was successful. And it's especially Italian fascism important because it was also exported to Germany. How did Adolf Hitler and the Nazis come to power? Well, first of all, and we can kind of deal with this question, it kind of goes along, why did some Germans support Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party? Right? So basically, remember, Germans were upset. They felt they had been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. It had been said to be all their fault. It put limitations on them and their army and their economy, and they were unhappy about that. Many were ashamed. But that wasn't enough to give the Nazis much support. What gave the Nazis a huge amount of support was the Great Depression of 1929. Right? Hitler before 1929 was relatively weak. He was on the fringe. But after 1929 in the Great Depression, Germany's unemployment rate shot up to 40%. And that led, and the liberal democracies didn't seem to be able to deal with those severe economic problems. And what bothered a lot of Germans was these economic problems led communism to become more popular. Right? Many people became very interested in communism. So some people said, you know what? There's some people who just like Hitler, who like fascism and think it's a good idea. But a lot of Germans just say, you know what? Liberal democracy doesn't seem strong enough to deal with anti-communism. We just need to vote for Hitler because he's a strong anti-communist leader. I may not agree with everything he says, some Germans are going to say, but you know what? He's the best choice of bad options. So that's going to win him, not a majority, but enough democratic support for him to be appointed to be chancellor, which is essentially the same thing as prime minister, which is similar to a president. We don't need to go into the differences, but he gets basically the chief executive office. And then he'll use that office as a way to expand and seize complete power. Right? There's going to be a fire in what's called the Reichstag, which is basically like the Congress building. There'll be a fire there, and there was a communist who actually had set the fire, and that allows Hitler to say, see, these communists are a real threat. You need to give me more power so I can deal with them. And he's going to use that power not just to deal with communists, but anyone who he sees as an enemy. And he will have them arrested. And even if you're not one of his enemies that he arrests, he has guys like this, these stormtroopers, who will go around and brutalize or intimidate his enemies. Right? If you say something that he doesn't like, these guys will show up on your front door or at your place of work or at your store and beat you up or just scare the daylights out of you. And in this way, he's eventually able to use that foothold to seize complete power in Germany. And he will disband any other organization that threatens him. Now, what happened to people who tried to resist this? Well, I already gave you a clue. They could be beaten up, they could be killed, they could be imprisoned, and the Nazis will be quite open about establishing concentration camps, which are these camps with very poor living conditions that aren't just for Jewish people. Those are extermination camps that are successful, particularly aimed at Jewish people. You don't ever get out of those. But these are for political prisoners, which you could theoretically get out of one day. But the Nazis quite openly arrested people for political crimes. So it made it very difficult to resist them. And you can also see this connection with the Hitler Youth, right? The Hitler Youth were basically Nazi Boy Scouts, right? But what was different about the Nazi Boy Scouts and American Boy Scouts were the Nazi, remember these kids, everyone had to join. It wasn't optional. And there was no other scouting groups that were allowed to exist. So you had to join this. And remember, when you joined, the kids took a personal oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Right? So they took a personal oath of loyalty. They didn't pledge allegiance to the flag or the Constitution. They took an oath of loyalty to Adolf Hitler. And remember, one other example I gave you was that they didn't learn how to use a knife, which is a tool. They were given daggers, which are a weapon. And you may remember in that video clip, the one boy even threatened his mother with a weapon, saying, or with the dagger, saying, you know, the Fuhrer comes first, my family comes second. So this is the way that they're kind of expanding power. And one thing I want to point out, I mean, this is atrocious, but for the kids, sometimes this was kind of cool, right? I can use this to challenge my parents, and it was fun. They went out and did a lot of fun things, went camping, did stuff like that. How did Nazi ideology justify the killing of unfit people? What was done to unfit Germans? Well, remember, they had this idea of social Darwinism that we're all locked in a struggle for survival, right? And they thought, like as we saw in that American, or that clip about the Americans, I'm sorry, remember we had that American state fair picture that said, you know, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. So they said, you know, we've got these unfit people, or what the Germans called life not worthy of life, who are holding us back. Right, and you can see that in this poster, right? It takes this much money to take care of this physically and mentally disabled man. You know, if we didn't have him, we'd have that money. And we could use that to make Germany great, right? We could use that to build tanks, to build factories, and that kind of thing. So they started sterilizing people without permission. There was an involuntary sterilization program, and they thought a whole lot of things. I mean, you could be sterilized for being an alcoholic, for being promiscuous, for things like that. But then they secretly said, you know, it's not enough just to prevent people like this from being born. Let's just get rid of the ones we have. So they had a secret euthanasia program that killed about 200,000 people. Curiously, this was one place where the Nazis were forced to back off because of protests among the German people. But they continued doing it just more deeply underground. But the whole idea is that, you know, these people are a burden. They hold back our country. Let's get rid of them so we don't have to waste resources on them. Because after all, we're locked in a struggle for survival with other human beings. And of course, they also justified it by pointing out, hey, the Americans are doing it. Remember, I always pointed out, you know, the Nazis copied some of their laws from Indiana, my home state. What was appeasement? Why was it criticized then? How were Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union similar? Why did some countries support the policy of appeasement? So here's the thing, right? And I won't go through each one of these, but if you look at these years, right? Each year Hitler is becoming stronger and is seizing more territory. And a question that people ask now is, why didn't they stop Hitler back in 35? Or why didn't they stop Hitler back in 36? Or why not 38? Why did they follow this policy of appeasement, right? Well, some of it has to do with the fact that it wasn't clear that Hitler and Stalin would necessarily be enemies, right? Later on in 1939, as kind of evidence of this, I know it happens later, but this was the thing people were worried about, they signed a non-aggression pact, right? Even it's kind of weird that Hitler would do this because he was so anti-communist, and he did it because he planned on breaking it later on. But the thing was, Hitler and Stalin were behaving in similar ways, which is why in 1939 Superman arrested them and brought them to an International Court of Justice. This is from the first Superman issue, or I should say Action Comics #1. So they're acting in a similar way. And France and Britain weren't sure what would happen if they went to war with Germany. If the Soviet Union supported Germany, they maybe couldn't defeat Germany. Similarly, even if the Soviet Union didn't support Germany, if it just held back and didn't help France or Britain, they weren't sure if they could defeat Germany. So they hoped that by standing back and letting Hitler expand a bit and do some things that kind of made sense to them, or that had a rational argument, that would avoid having another world war. We have to remember, France and Britain had just fought a major war that killed millions of people, and they weren't really keen on fighting another one. Especially remember France, you know, we looked at the statistics, a whole bunch of French people were wounded and killed, right? Only 4 out of 10 working age men were unharmed by the war. So they were nervous about another one, and they didn't think that the Soviet Union would necessarily support them. Like I said, the Soviet Union was behaving much like Germany was. It was annexing other countries. So at the time, they just did not know which side the Soviet Union would be on. They remember the horrors of the Great War. But finally, when the Soviet Union and Germany invaded Poland, France and Britain declared war on Germany, not the Soviet Union, because Germany was the most immediate threat, right? It was the one that actually, Germany shares a border with France. Why was Germany able to defeat the British and French forces in French so quickly? Well, there's the saying, people always prepare for the last war. So Britain and France both expected a war, like a trench warfare, like in World War I, that favored the defenders. And I gave you an example of this. I gave you this, what's it called? The Maginot Line, right, where the French built these very strong fortifications between France and Germany. And they also had weaker fortifications here. So France thought the war would be a lot like World War I. The problem was Germans utilized this form of warfare called blitzkrieg, literally mean lightning war, in which infantry, tanks, airplanes work closely together to advance quickly and destroy the opponent's army. And basically they just took these forces, went around, and attacked the strong fortifications from behind where they weren't as strong. So unfortunately for France and Britain, they had prepared for the last war, whereas Germany had innovated. And through this mobile warfare, was able to take a lot of territory very quickly. Question 11, what did Germany do during the Battle of Britain? How did the British respond, and who won? So Germany bombed, right? Germany, remember, it's conquered France, so it wants to invade Britain, and it starts bombing the British people in an effort to make the British people give up. The British people, though, will fight back. The Battle of Britain is this kind of struggle for the air, for the sky over Britain, and the British will win. Right? The Nazis will lose. They won't be able to ever take the sky. Since the Germans are not able to seize the sky, they can't actually invade Britain. Right? So Britain, because it wins this air battle, the Battle of Britain, will not face a land invasion. Let's see. Why did Hitler attack the Soviet Union even though he had not defeated Britain? How did that attack change the war? So remember, this seems like kind of a crazy idea, right? Hitler's not able to defeat Britain, so why would he attack the Soviet Union? Well, first of all, remember, Hitler was a very strong anti-communist, and he didn't really, he actually kind of admired the British. His heart wasn't in fighting the British. He thought the British were pretty cool. They were fellow kind of Aryans, so he was fine with them. But the Soviet Union, he saw, because it was communist, as his major ideological foe, and he was worried because every day it seemed to be getting stronger. In fact, it was stronger than they even thought. And he said, we got to defeat them now. Each day we wait to attack the Soviet Union is one day that they have to get stronger. And he said, once we defeat the Soviet Union, the British will give up. Right? Once we do that, they'll give up. But also what was key was, even if he conquered Britain, he still had a big problem. He didn't have oil. Right? To have a blitzkrieg, you need oil. Right? Remember, fighters and tanks both need oil. Right? Planes and tanks both need oil. So he said, even if we defeat Britain, we still have a problem. We don't have access to oil. The Soviet Union has oil. So we need to attack and seize oil from the Soviet Union. And this almost worked, right? I want to stress, his plan, as crazy as it sounds now, it almost worked. Now, how did that attack change the war? Well, because now the Soviet Union was on the side of Britain. Right? Soviet Union was kind of in between. It wasn't on the side of Britain, it wasn't on the side of Germany. But once Germany attacks the Soviet Union is now an enemy of Germany. Britain's an enemy of Germany. You know the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Right? The enemy of my enemy is the friend. Britain and Soviet Union both share an enemy. Let's see, what did the Germans do to Russian Jews and other unfit people once they invaded Russia? How did this policy affect German soldiers? And the answer was they went around executing them. They had those special units, the Einsatzgruppen, whose job it was to go around shooting Jews and other people that they didn't want around. And I think it's very disturbing, but remember we watched that video, and it basically made the soldiers who did that go crazy. Right? And they talked about, you remember the letter where the guy said, we have to drink and eat a lot because of our work? Well, they were drinking a lot of alcohol. Because they had to get really, really drunk in order to shoot these people. So this was a serious problem. Both morally speaking, but from the Nazi perspective, this wasn't good for their soldiers, right? Because this is making them go crazy. Let's see. What factors contributed to Germany's defeat in its fight against the Soviet Union? Well, in the past, Russian armies, like for example in World War I, usually the Russian soldiers were generally good soldiers, but they had bad leadership and were poorly supplied. But in World War II, they still had good troops. The leadership was getting better, and they had more supplies, right? Stalin had engaged in this brutal industrialization, but it worked. They were able to have more domestic supplies, and later the United States and Great Britain, especially the United States, will help supply the Soviet Union with a lot of equipment. We supply them with a huge amount of equipment. In addition, the blitzkrieg does not work in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's too big, and the problem for the Germans is when they invade in the fall. The winter is like the worst winter for many decades in the Soviet Union. And so there's all this snow and ice. Tanks don't operate well in that. And then when it melted, there was just a bunch of mud in which tanks also don't operate well. So that gave time for the Russians to recover, to move factories back, to mobilize their population and rebuild their armies. And then they were able to destroy the Nazis. Also, that Germany and Japan were not good at working with each other. Germany in particular was bad about telling Japan what it was going to do. So instead of saying, hey, let's attack the Soviet Union together, the Germans signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, so Japan thought, oh, okay, they're not going to attack them. Let's concentrate on other areas. And so Japan had committed to attacking the United States in 1941. And then while the Nazis already invaded the Soviet Union, so they couldn't just attack the Soviet Union together. So the Germans in the end will be defeated in Russia. They won't get the Russian or North African oil, and so eventually they'll be ground down. What did the United States see itself as fighting for in World War II? What problems did the United States have during this time period? And I said, think cartoon ducks. I was thinking particularly of Donald Duck. Right? Remember that cartoon? They focused on the idea that we don't want to live in Nazi land, or the Nazis, Nazi Germany, because you don't have political or economic freedom. Right? We work all the time and we don't get anything. Remember, he had the aroma de bacon and eggs. That was his breakfast, and the wood sandwich. He had his hidden coffee bean. So the idea was, hey, we don't like these Nazis because they take away your political and economic freedom. However, right, when we talk about the problems. Sometimes people, when they look back, they say, oh, we don't like the Nazis because they were racist. Well, the United States had a segregated army at this time period, right? So the army that defeated the Nazis, or helped defeat the Nazis, I should say, was a segregated army, right? Where African Americans were kept in kind of a, what's the word I'm looking for? Secondary position, inferior position, where they were kind of pushed aside. And similarly, right, when we established our own concentration camps, we called them internment camps, but for people of Japanese ancestry, even if they were U.S. citizens, we put them in camps simply based on their race out of a fear that they might aid the Japanese. And this was particularly unjust as there is no case of any of them actually having done so. Not a single one, despite there being, I think, several 100,000 Japanese people in the United States, not a single one has any record of being a spy or anything like that. So we had some problems. What was D-Day? D-Day was the Allied invasion of France. It's the attempt to kind of push back the Nazis, right? And I always remember my parents' anniversary because they were married on D-Day. Shows I'm a better historian than a son. It should be reversed, right? I should remember D-Day because it's my parents' anniversary, but I remember it the other way around. But it's the Allied invasion of France, recovering France and for the Allies and for the French people, and defeating the Germans. Oops. How did the Nazi attempt to exterminate Jewish people change over time, and why? Well, you've got remember we talked about how they went around just shooting Jewish people, and that made their soldiers crazy. So they switched tactics, and the tactics were very effective because they were able to kill 6 to 7 million Jewish people. That's 2/3 of all European Jews. So this killed a huge number of Jewish people. Right, killed a huge number of Jewish people. And the way that they did this was to be more efficient and less disturbing. They set up these what they called showers, right? So instead of shooting people in the head, you would take them and tell them they're going to have a shower, which they wanted because they've been in a train usually for several days, taking them to the extermination camp. They go into the shower, you'd close the doors, hit a few buttons, and then it would just release poison gas, which would kill them, and you'd open the doors and they'd all be dead. Right? It was much cleaner, wouldn't drive you as crazy as just simply shooting people. And this allowed them to then kill 6 or 7 million people efficiently. But like I say, if you've got to do things like that, you pretty much know what you're doing is wrong. Japan is interesting, right? Because Japan was an Axis power, but it was not. It wasn't completely like Germany or Italy because it was only partly fascist. Those two countries were fascist. So in some ways Japan was fascist, in some ways it was not fascist. It was fascist in that it was anti-communist, and that there was growing state control of industry, there was extreme nationalism, you had an extraordinarily authoritarian government, and society was increasingly militarized. That's fascist. But it was different. There was no mass party. There was no equivalent to the Nazi party. There were no brown shirts or anything like that, or the stormtroopers. And also, Emperor Hirohito was very different from Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler was this dynamic, charismatic speaker that was always like on the radio and always giving speeches. Hirohito was this quiet guy who rarely talked. And when he did talk, he read his paper, or he read his speech, and he didn't talk over the radio to people. The only time during World War II he was on the radio was when Japan surrendered. Right, and in that case, it wasn't even live. He recorded a record. Just as an aside, some Japanese people who didn't want to surrender tried to steal the record, so it couldn't be played. Kind of curious aspect of history. So there's some things similar, some things different. What did Japan want to obtain from China? What strategy did Japan pursue in its war with China? How did Japan's war in China lead it to attack the United States? So the quick answer, right? What does Japan want? It wants resources. Right, very simple. Right, we kind of already covered that. Wants resources, wants to get them from China. The problem, though, is that the war in China is not going well. Right? Remember, in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, the Japanese easily defeated the Chinese in just a few months. They threatened the Chinese capital, and the Chinese instantly gave up. But because of the growth of Chinese nationalism, the Chinese will not give up. Japan seizes the new capital of Beijing. The old capital of Beijing, the new capital of Nanjing, and Shanghai, the major economic center of China, and the Chinese do not give up. So Japan says, okay, we're going to break the Chinese through brutality. So they start terror bombing Japanese civilians. They purposely target Japanese civilians, the Japanese purposely target Chinese civilians for bombing. They will use biological warfare. They will infect rats with bubonic plague and let the rats go to infect Chinese people. They will, when they do seize the Chinese capital of Nanjing, for 6 weeks they let the soldiers just do whatever they want, which includes raping a large number of people and killing a couple 100,000 civilians. And this goes on for 6 weeks. So this wasn't just an issue of some soldiers behaving badly. This was military policy. And this fails, right? This fails. And because it fails, Japan says, uh-oh, we need more resources. We fought this war for resources, but it's costing us more resources than it's giving it to us, so we need to expand. So we're going to expand into Vietnam, right, which was a French colony. We're going to expand into Vietnam. And it was clear that the reason they wanted to do that was because if they expanded here, they could seize this territory, which were British and Dutch colonies, to get the oil there and the rubber there. That was kind of their goal. Right? That was their goal. So the U.S. was upset about that, and we said, hey, you got to withdraw from Vietnam, you got to withdraw from China, or we're not going to trade with you anymore. And specifically, we said, we're not going to trade oil with you. We supplied 80% of Japan's oil. So that was sort of a big deal, that we would not trade oil with them. So they responded by launching an attack on us at Pearl Harbor. Right? Now, this may seem crazy, right? Why did Japan begin a war that seemed destined to lose? What strategy did it follow? Well, how could it withdraw from China after losing so many people, right? They'd fought in China for about 3 years by this time, had lost tens of thousands of soldiers. They're not just going to leave because someone asked them to, right? And the problem is, if they withdraw from China, they still have that basic problem. They don't have the resources they need. So if they withdraw, they know they're eventually going to be defeated one day anyway. They're going to fall apart. They're not going to have the resources needed to maintain their empire. So they decide, okay, let's attack the United States, Great Britain, and the Netherlands, grab a bunch of resources, grab this territory down here, which they do successfully. That will give us the oil, the rubber, and the other things we need. And then we'll just fight back, and we'll kill a bunch of the enemy. We may lose battles, but that's okay. As long as we kill enough Americans, they will eventually give up and negotiate a peace with us. That may sound crazy, and it does end up not working because the United States is much more powerful than they kind of realize, and are more willing to accept casualties than they realize. But this is exactly what Japan had done during the Russo-Japanese War. Right? It had fought Russia, it won most of the battles. Russia could have kept fighting, but eventually the Russians said, okay, we're too tired from this, so let's negotiate a peace. So Japan decided to roll the dice. Maybe we can fight. If we don't fight, we're going to lose. Eventually, we're going to run out of resources. But if we keep fighting, maybe in the end, we can get a negotiated peace. So continuing section 10, we're on question 23. So section 10, question 23. What was the significance of the Battle of Guadalcanal? right? And the big thing I wanted people to understand about this battle was that things were not going well for Japan in the early part of the war. The Americans are really good at killing the Japanese, right? For every one American that the Japanese kill, we kill 22 Japanese. This is because of our superior technology. At this point, we're doing very well. And what's key about this, and I hate to talk about human life in this kind of way, but I think it's necessary to understand the situation. We can replace one American fairly easily. We have a large population. Japan doesn't. It has a smaller population. It's been at war for 3 years, so it's very difficult for them to replace those 22 people. So we can replace our losses and keep fighting the war. They cannot. So that's a big problem for them. In addition, remember, they're tied down in China. Japan has been fighting in China. They're still fighting in China. The United States will only fight 1/6 of the Japanese military. China will fight the 5/6 of the Japanese military. So we're just able to, in the early part of the war, to kill large numbers of Japanese people without too much difficulty and just slowly advance across the Pacific. Now, why was the fight then? I mean, you look at that and say, well, why was it so bad? If Americans were so good at killing large numbers of Japanese people, why was it so brutal? And there's multiple reasons. Oh, I'm sorry, and I'm going to connect this to question 26. What was the significance of the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa? So why was this war so brutal, right? Even when early on, you have a very good kind of kill ratio, you could say. Well, for one thing, remember the video we watched, right? The Japanese generally did not want to surrender. Japanese civilians would kill themselves rather than surrendering a lot of the time, right? So this made this kind of horrible war. And sometimes the Japanese civilians wouldn't just kill themselves, or they wouldn't kill themselves, they would kill Americans. Remember there was the soldier who talked about how a old Japanese woman took out a grenade and killed an American soldier, and so he shot her. And then when that happens, you can't really trust even civilians. So Americans were very hesitant to take prisoners. And because of this strange behavior, one thing I should point out, early in the war, when some Americans prepared to accept a Japanese surrender, it turned out just to be a trick. And when the Americans let their guard down, thinking they were accepting a Japanese surrender, they were ambushed. So Americans were not so interested in taking prisoners. We also remember they talked about how Japanese mutilated American dead and wounded. So Americans who were already fairly racist, started to see Japanese as insects, as dirty, dangerous animals that needed to be killed. And we started fighting the war in that way. And in particular, if civilians start acting like soldiers, if non-combatants start acting like combatants, you're going to kill them. You're going to treat them like soldiers and kill them. So this is going to be very brutal. The Japanese will also use tactics like kamikaze. And this makes sense from a Japanese perspective. Remember, this actually worked well. This was a fairly effective tactic, but it convinced the Americans, these guys are crazy and are going to do whatever they can to defeat us, even if it means killing themselves. So this war is very, very brutal. So the Americans, and also one thing I want to stress, and this is where I wanted you to know the significance of two battles, Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Guadalcanal, we killed 22 Japanese for every one American. But in the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, it dropped to about a 1-to-2 ratio. One American could kill 2 Japanese. I won't go into it in this class, but the Japanese figured out how to fight better and how to nullify America's kind of technological superiority. And because of that, they got much better at killing Americans. So now it looks like it's going to be very high cost for us to keep fighting the war because the Japanese are so good at killing us now. So the Americans don't want to deal with that, right? We want to minimize losses. We're a democracy. We're going to do anything we can to minimize losses to our troops. Remember General Patton, you don't win a war by dying for your country. You win the war by making the other guy die for his country. So we'll start using firebombing, right? Curtis LeMay, under pressure to win this war with a minimum number of deaths among American soldiers, is going to launch these firebombing raids, which are very effective at destroying Japanese industry. But remember, they also start fires that destroy the surrounding towns, surrounding neighborhoods, and kill civilians. But he's fine with that. Like I said, we weren't purposely targeting civilians, but we did take action that we knew would kill lots of civilians. We use these in Germany too, by the way. And then as an extension of this, once we get the atomic bombs online, we will use those too. So that's why this is, such a brutal war. You have these sides that are just trying to kill each other by any means necessary, and are just not interested in taking prisoners, and that really have a lot of contempt for each other. 29, what was the human cost of the war? Well, the Soviet Union and China each lost about 20 million people, right? So they lost huge numbers of people. Remember, that's one reason why the Soviet Union will expand after the Cold War, because it doesn't want to have a war that's going to cost that many lives again. 2/3 of European Jews are killed, right? 6 or 7 million. Like I say, I don't understand what 6 or 7 million means, but I do understand what 2 out of 3 means, right? So the majority of European Jews died. Lots of people were enslaved, made to become forced laborers. You even had women. The Japanese Empire forced women from the Philippines, China, Korea to become basically military prostitutes. And this total dead was about 75 million, but there were also moral costs, right? This was a war in which a huge number of civilians died. Many more civilians than soldiers died in this war, right? So it's war increasingly that's going to kill civilians. And this comic, by the way, that's Willie and Joe. This is kind of fun. This was drawn by a soldier during World War II. And I feel like a fugitive from the law of averages. There's bullets all around. And he's like, on average, we should get killed with all these bullets. So that's kind of the dark humor that Willie and Joe had.